So, if you work in technology, you've probably noticed that there's a shift happening. The amount of releases and announcements in these last few weeks have been extraordinary. So, I wanted to talk to someone who has a lot of experience with AI and how it's affecting humanity. Hey there, I'm your host, Ravi Villalobos, a software engineer and senior staff instructor at LinkedIn Learning. And today I'm talking to Brandy Nonnecke. She directs the Tech Policy Initiative, a collaboration between Citrus and the Goldman School at UC Berkeley to strengthen tech policy, education, research, and impact. Brandie is also the director of Our Better Web, a program that supports empirical research, policy analysis training, and engagement to address the sharp rise of online harms. She's also a co-director of the Berkeley Center for Law and Technology at Berkeley Law, where she leads the project on artificial intelligence, platforms, and society. And she also directs the UC Berkeley AI Policy Hub, an interdisciplinary initiative training researchers to develop effective AI governance and policy framework. Her research and writing has been featured in Science, Wired, NPR, and BBC News, among others. Brandy, can you tell me a little bit about your journey into artificial intelligence?
Yeah, and first, thank you so much for having me today and that very long introduction from all of the different types of activities I'm engaged in. And hats, the AI space. There's a lot of work that needs to be done on both the technical front, how we build responsible systems, and then also on the governance front, how we ensure that we are building those systems responsibly and deploying them responsibly. So, how did I get into the AI space? Well, I think a lot of us are in this space now because of its transition from, I was always looking at emerging technology and very conscientious about the human rights impacts of emerging tech. Of course, right now, artificial intelligence is really at the, foreground of everybody's mind about potential risks. So it's a really exciting space. I think also that we have to be a little bit tempered in our view of AI. While there are great risks, there are also great benefits.
Which is really what I'm excited to talk to you about. I watched a lot of your videos online and some of the writings that you have done. And I really like that about you, that you really always try to sort of bring a lot of the positive effects that it can have. Clearly, there's a lot of talks, and I think that you get a lot more, I don't know, things in the news that are maybe a little bit negative, but there's a lot of positive stuff happening there. So let's start with regulation. There's been a lot of talk about regulating artificial intelligence and the industry. And as a matter of fact, Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, and others have repeatedly talked about the importance of regulation. So can you share your thoughts about why it's so important?
Yeah, regulation is really important. And first, before I make my remark on this, there's one trope that really bothers me, and it's the
Mm.
trope that regulation stifles innovation. I don't think that that is true. For example, if you look at the clean energy space, it's one of the most regulated spaces, but
Mm.
also one of the most innovative. So I really caution against that knee jerk reaction that we often hear from industry saying that regulation will stifle innovation or that regulation will harm smaller companies, because I actually think that smaller companies can have a late mover advantage where, because they are smaller and more nimble, they can implement these regulations in a way that allows them to scale their business and implement all of these strategies rather than larger companies that already have these entrenched systems of governance where it might be a little bit harder. Almost thinking of it like trying to turn a ship. Obviously, larger ship, harder to turn.
Hmm.
And the power of regulation, I think there's a lot of efforts right now, especially the European Union has stepped out as the forerunner in proposing the most comprehensive piece of legislation, the EU AI Act, which will be passed into law. And there will definitely be spillover effects of that law in other jurisdictions, including the United States. If any of the listeners remember hearing about the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation, and you're now affected by that, you can see it in the way that you interact with platforms where they give you, they tell you what data they're using, or you opt in or opt out of the use of cookies. The same thing is going to happen with the AI Act, where even if you are not an EU resident, you will be affected by this regulation. Now, in the United States, we've had several pieces of legislation proposed at the federal level. um, including the Algorithmic Accountability Act, which was reintroduced twice. It's on its second introduction, and that was proposed by Senator Wyden. But there are other, like the National AI Initiative Act was passed into law, which established the National AI Initiative Office within the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. They are helping to lead several efforts. Also, oversight over the NIST AI risk management framework. So, there are initiatives at the federal level. However, the NIST AI risk management framework, for example, is a voluntary commitment by companies. It is not required.
Yeah, and I really love what you said about the smaller companies can actually do better here. And we saw that in OpenAI being a very tiny company that is really advancing things like ChatGPT that became the most popular product in the history of technology in just a couple of months with 100 million users. It took them like 5 days to get to a million. And on the other side, you saw companies like Google just look really sluggish. So you're seeing that just like when maybe the internet first came out, a lot of innovation is
Mhm.
happening really quickly. You're seeing the response, of regulation happen at the same time, maybe a little bit faster than what we got on the internet. And I think that it's necessary. And what I tell people is, it's not a matter of whether or not we should have regulation. It's a matter of what that regulation is going to be. We have gone too far, too fast, and had too much experience with the internet to understand that things need to be regulated for the good of humankind. And it's going to be more of an issue of how that happens. And I'd be good to see some efforts that you mentioned there. So in the same way, we've seen this just crazy amount of innovation from companies like OpenAI, Microsoft, and Google. How do you feel about the pace of these product releases that are happening in AI? In the last few weeks, we heard announcements including Live 365, Copilot from GitHub, Midjourney 5 just released, and they said that Midjourney 6 was going to be 2 months away. So we went from 5 to 6 in a couple of months. Yesterday, we had Adobe Firefly that just released, trying to skirt some of the copyright issues that other companies have run into. We had Google Bard, and much more than that. Just I've never seen a pace, and I'm used to, like, I work in front and full stack development. I'm used to a fast workflow, but I have never seen anything like it before. So how can regulation possibly match or deal with this pace?
Great question. And I do find it pretty funny to see the companies all racing to release these products because they see the other company releasing. It was clear that I think OpenAI really jumped the gun on releasing GPT-3 and GPT-4, and the other companies too, releasing before they had actually vetted the technology. It seemed more of they wanted to release it and allow people to play with it to be able to better understand how might people use it. And let me just give one example. When GPT-3 was first released, I had an account and I went on there and I said, create a debate between President Biden and President Trump about the legitimacy of the election. And there it went. It spit out this well written exchange between them. The voices of both sounded very much how they would speak. I was pretty impressed, pretty shocked. A couple weeks later, I went back in, I tried to do it again. I'm seeing it thinking, it's working on it. And then all of a sudden, a pop up comes up and says, this is a political issue involving an election. We will not provide the response to that because of the potential risk to, a fair democracy.
Mm.
So I'm thinking, who decided and when that they wouldn't do that anymore? So to me, one of the issues is around transparency requirements around their decision making process, transparency requirements on the data that they're using around the model. And I think that might be actually where in the United States we can first have impact is around transparency. And if we have that, I think that we can reach a deeper level of accountability.
Yes, that's true. And interesting that you did mention that the nimbleness of some of these smaller companies is what makes them able to do those things, to actually react to, I don't know if it's the market or legislation. They're clearly very reactive, What's been interesting to me is that, with the Microsoft releases, we saw that whenever they're actually showing you the release, they're at the same time in every one of the demos telling you, hey, you definitely want to check this data. Like, you're going to get something back, but you need to make sure that you accurately verify and test. Like, they're telling you while they're releasing that it's useful in a lot of ways, but you can't really rely on the information that you get from this, which I'd never seen before. I had seen products in beta, like everybody remembers, like Gmail when it first came out, it was in beta for what seemed like forever, 5 years or something. But I've never seen them release something and at the same time admit that it's potentially awful. And we
Yeah.
saw a lot of that, which is very strange. We were in this new phase of creativity that companies are just putting stuff out there, and they're I don't know. I don't know if that's like a preemptive sort of legal type of thing that they're trying to do, or where that came from, but I hadn't seen that before. Just curious to your thoughts
I
on that.
I think right now it's completely unregulated. And as I mentioned in my earlier remarks, that in the United States, really the only mechanism we have right now is the NIST AI risk management framework, which is a voluntary framework that
Hmm.
companies can implement to evaluate their data. For example, ChatGPT speaks in a certain way where it's unrepresentative of the diversity of voices, even just in the United States, let alone globally. Uh, and so part of it is around testing and validation before release. Now, the EU AI Act has a tiered level of risk, and higher risk systems would need to actually implement something called conformity assessments, where they would evaluate whether or not the system is producing spurious results, discriminatory results, and the company would have to put in place safeguards to mitigate those risks before it could be deployed in the European market. Now, in the United States, where, innovation first, I don't know if we could ever pass any legislation that would require just a blanket requirement across all generative AI to put in place these safeguards. However, I do think that there could be certain application areas that would. One example, New York City has a law on the books that if you are deploying an AI enabled tool for human resources, you have to do an assessment to make sure that it is not discriminatory in any way before it can be used by any entity in New York City. That law is still in the process of being rolled out, but I think that perhaps in these high risk areas like health, human resources, policing, education, we might be able to start to implement some of these requirements. I also think it might happen quicker at the state level, which is not great because then
Hmm.
those companies they'll have to follow different laws in different states, develop tools in different ways. I really think we do need that federal law that will better
Yeah. So
ensure that we are designing and
it
deploying AI in the interests
it
of society.
it seems that on the one hand, companies are just rushing to get things out first because it always, pays to be out there with something. Right now, Google is looking really sluggish, even though they had a lot of the early models before anyone else. I think that it did affect their main product, which is search. Some of these things really have a clear impact on
Mhm.
search, and so perhaps that's a reason why they didn't want to release these things, because it competes with them directly in a lot of ways, and why Microsoft sees a really huge opening. And I heard Satya Nadella talk about how, we are a very small player in the search market. If we're able to gain a little bit of market share, that's going to be huge for us, and it's going to be bad for Google because they're in the position that they're trying not to lose market share. And this is why I think some of this is happening. You did mention very clearly there have been a lot of issues, technical issues in the implementation of some of these tools. Everything from Mid-Journey's like weird hand problem, or sometimes it would make like somebody with like 500 teeth in their mouth. And some of these are
Yeah.
being addressed, but not before the products are released. Do you feel like these companies are exposed to like potential liability, or how can they justify this pace?
That's a great question because around liability, it essentially falls on the hands right now of the implementer, whoever's using that technology. Now, again, I'm going to talk again about the EU AI Act because we have
Hmm.
had some debate about whether or not generative AI systems, because of their very nature, should be considered high risk. And as such, by default, regardless of the area that they're being implemented, they would have to put in place these risk assessments in the mitigation of risk. Now, definitely they are moving quite fast in the US and releasing these tools. The liability issue, I think, is not so much with, like Chat GPT, um, as of right now, but there are also these issues around copyright, which I think
Hmm.
is a big deal. And then also data protection and data rights. So many of you may remember a pretty famous case about Clearview AI that had scraped LinkedIn data to create a facial recognition system. And Illinois has a biometric law that gives individuals the right over their, any biometrics, face being like the primary one in the Clearview AI example. And because of that, Clearview AI had to essentially disgorge or get rid of that ill gotten data because they hadn't received the appropriate approval from Illinois residents. So there are some areas where I think that there can be pushback, like in data protection. So if a company has acquired your data without approval, and you live in a state that has a data protection law, for example, in California, where we have the California Consumer Privacy Act and the California Privacy Rights Act, there can be some movement there. And then also in the copyright space, we've seen a class action lawsuit brought forward against like Dolly and Midjourney because they do use artists' works that can create art that looks incredibly similar to the artist's
Hmm.
original piece, and there's a worry that that could degrade the value of the artist's work.
Yeah, and there's definitely places where people are mentioning the name of the artist. They're saying, "Do this in the style of whomever it is." And so, right now, do the artists have credit or they receive some sort of credit? That's like a big conversation that the industry is having. While at the same time, we're seeing like Adobe Firefly, which I mentioned, try to bypass some of those issues by releasing a model that was based off of their photo library. So perhaps that's a way. A lot of people were asking for images, and they would get something that looked very similar to like the Getty Images logo because these things had been trained on publicly available data that maybe had a watermark and it was able to generate some art, but you could still tell that it was either signing things like an artist would, so it would kind of be the signature of a
Right.
famous artist, or it would be like some sort of like Getty Images logo looking thing on the corner. Clearly, there are some suits that are going around that. And you also mentioned with GPT some of the issues that it just was having regarding some of the awful things that the AIs were saying, and that's one of the things that they
Right.
tried to fix in GPT-4. People were asking things, or at least they were prompting things like, "How do you get the most people with only $1?" And so they are very clearly, almost in real time, attempting to mitigate some of these issues. But it's almost like trying to what do they say? Stop like a fire hose. There's just so much stuff coming out that there just seems to be this I don't know, dual track of people just trying to produce content and AIs and the technologists having to take him down. Like we talked, I think a little bit about one of my favorite images that I found was this company or this AI product from Stanford called Alpaca. I just love this image of the alpaca. But they released this model, and just yesterday they had to take it down because of some of those same issues that the alpaca model started to hallucinate. I think I saw or I heard Sam Altman saying that the problem with these models is that without adequate controls, they tend to do these type of things naturally. And so you can't just create the model and not pretend but assume that it's going to be on bias, because it is going to be biased in a horrible way most of the time. And so, I don't know what the correct sort of approach is, but I don't know if you feel that, you're gonna have to let, what do they say, like break a few eggs or something, in order to actually notice the problems, or perhaps some of the work that OpenAI and other companies have been doing are seeing the problems. And when you have something like Stanford, who tried to do like a more open model of, as opposed to the
Mhm.
closed OpenAI model, you just you're going to run into these things without any controls. It's just not going to be a good thing. So, um, I don't know. So what do you think about the ability of these models? This is a really interesting thing, I'm glad I have you here. That are performing super well in exams like the bar, and they can outperform most people on those exams. That's a really strange thing that I didn't expect before. So if I think GPT-4 performed in the top 10th percentile of the bar exam, and the previous version was able to pass, but only in the bottom 10th percentile. Is the age of testing humans like over? Are we done with testing? What does this do to things like education, and something as technical as lawyers and doctors, where the AIs are able to perform better? What's your thoughts on those things?
Yeah, I did see those results, and I saw some discussion on Twitter that the model itself was very likely trained on, a lot of data, right, that they'd pulled online. So it was probably trained from past LSAT guidance and
Hmm.
responses. So essentially, it was validating against its training data, which is a big no-no because it's just
Mm,
validating that it can recall what it was trained on, not necessarily that it had learned something and can apply it in a new domain. So I think that that's one of the main issues. And we're talking about artificial intelligence, and while I do understand the role of standardized tests, I actually think that this is a pretty good example that perhaps it's not measuring true intelligence, but recall and how people are actually training to take exams. So
mm,
GPT is perfect at executing the functions in that exam. Now, whether or not they can apply those skills to be able to think creatively, as a lawyer or as a doctor, thinking outside the box, has, I think, yet to be seen. But of course, we're still at the early stages of these technologies.
it's going to be really interesting to see how things like testing work. I mean, do we become a society that is more focused on things like, internships, or ways of, like, you know ways other than tests to validate your ability to perform in a specific job? I just think that this is such a huge thing, for us, where you go to an interview for a developer, and they want to ask you, they want to first put you through some sort of standardized test, because it's just easier to validate 500 or 1,000 people. I mean, there are some
Right.
issues in terms of, biases in that as well, but companies are always looking for some sort of shortcut, especially when they're larger and they have to just process so much data. They're going to look for those efficiencies, but at the same time, some of these, models are now able to perhaps not outperform the test, but like you said, if you are testing to, I don't know, optimize for the way that computers are good at recalling things, then maybe the
Hmm.
tests need to now change. So super interesting time that we're living in. So
Yeah.
advancements
Quickly
that
on
we,
that, though, I
oh, so go
think
ahead. Yeah. Hmm.
there are two things. First, I think that, look, these tools can be used for mundane, repetitive tasks.
Hmm.
And I think that's great. Why not offload some of that mundane, tedious tasks that you have to do to that third party agent? And then just, I think it's also really important, though, that you double check what it's producing and that you don't overly rely on it to make some automated decision. Because obviously, at this stage, we know that there are definitely false statements coming out of these tools. But then, second, I actually think that these tools might enable us to become more creative. So when I
Mm,
was playing with Chat GPT 3 and 4, I gave it a prompt, write an op-ed on a topic that I'm very familiar with, and it spit it
Mhm.
out. And sure enough, the flow was almost exactly how I would have written it. And then that made me think, wow, I'm not really that creative, am I? I'm essentially following a standard style within my
Hmm.
industry or my sector. Um, so I think actually becoming more aware of that, maybe we will become even more creative writers and artists.
Yeah, in a way, I think the models are actually training us and prompting us to think of things differently. And I totally can relate to that because I've used it a lot. What I find it extremely useful for is when I have like a writer's block or a developer's block, and I'm just trying to think of a quantity of ideas for a topic that I'm working on. So, say like if I was preparing for one of our interviews, I might ask it to give me 100 questions that you might ask somebody on this topic, and you can pick questions that are good, but in terms of quantity, the computers can just outdo you.
Yeah,
If you try to think of like 100 or 200 questions, you would have a hard time, but the computer can do that in a few seconds. And so
exactly.
for creativity, I think it kind of unlocks that. um, Now I can almost assume that I'm never going to be stuck coming up with ideas, but I'll need to identify what makes a good idea good and what's not a good idea. Or you've seen it write pretty, I mean, better poetry than I would ever be able to write. So it's not my thing. But in some, I think you really need to find out what its positive impacts are. You've seen it do fantastic things like be able to identify cancers, sometimes better than doctors. Last week we were talking to the VP of AI at LinkedIn, and he was mentioning that now some of the work that he was doing at Netflix was doing a recommendation engine, which is really difficult because you have all these different algorithms that you write, and that these AIs are not able to give you better recommendations because of the way that they understand a lot more data than a human could. And he previously worked at a medical company, and he said that, when we go to a doctor, the doctor has like 15 minutes to be with us. He's got a stack of like maybe previous, of your file can be like really thick. So he doesn't have time to process all that data in an efficient way. But an AI could help in that sense, allowing to sort of summarize some of the maybe issues that after analyzing all that data and, before the doctor even gets to see you, that doctor will be more informed and can be a better experience for everyone. So we saw some advancements in things like Mid Journey, and scary technology like deep fakes are getting
Mhm.
better. But now it feels like we're in a point where we can no longer trust reality. Now that these AIs can generate fake people, generate content with people we know doing things they aren't doing, what kind of sort of things do you think we can do to sort of deal with that aspect of this generative AI, the ability to change reality and whew,
Yeah, now living in this post-truth society, even yesterday, I saw quite a few images that were created, I believe, using Midjourney, where they were depicting Trump
mhm,
resisting arrest, and they looked incredibly convincing at first glance. Of course, if you go and you look a little bit closer, there will be like a random hand coming out of someone's shoulder.
mm,
So it's not 100% out of the uncanny valley, but it's getting close. And one thing that I think that we can do, there's been some work on if you are generating this, so you're an Adobe, you're a Midjourney, you're another company, actually putting a cryptographic hash onto
mm,
whatever's created so that you know that it is a manipulation. And that could be communicated to an end user when it's uploaded to a platform. The platform can recognize that cryptographic hash and say, market saying that it is, synthetic media to bring more awareness. Because just relying on individuals to be good actors, I think, is tenuous.
yeah, thankfully, I think that the computers can actually do a lot of things to mitigate uh, that those negative uses. I know that when I worked in radio, um, we used to rely on people filling out surveys in order to determine who was being listened to the most. And then at some point, the companies that were tracking that, Nielsen would just release basically what would be like a beeper, like a little device that you would just wear, and it would follow you and listen to everything you were listening to. Now, what was interesting that it was that what you were listening, it was able to hide certain signals that communicated a lot of things and transmitted that back, so that they would able to be accurately know like what station you were listening to, what time, whether if you were listening to that piece of music, say at a grocery store, or you were just walking past somebody with a radio. Like those are the kind of things that I think technology can be really good at, inserting things that validate where that data is coming from. And I think that that's going to be some of the really, I think, interesting work that we could be doing worldwide to kind of mitigate those issues. But the stuff is just becoming so good that, we talked about, or we haven't talked about this, but there's all this technology that can make someone sound exactly like someone else
Yes.
within like seconds. Like it just takes seconds to train these AIs to be able to, duplicate things. I think that some of that can be really wonderful. Some of that can be maybe help somebody with maybe who's been disabled and no longer able to speak, communicate with their family in a way that sounds like them. I've often thought if you had, somebody who has lost the ability to speak, that it's going to give some of that back, vision, the ability to see things
Yeah.
and send that to people. Some of the things that can happen can be wonderful, but all the stuff that's in the news, it's always the shocking things. So talk a
Yeah,
little bit
that
about the research that you're
dystopian.
done at, yeah, the dystopian stuff. So you actually do a lot of work on this at the Citrus Policy Lab, and you're working on how to address some of these technologies. So talk a little bit about your work there and some of the projects that you're working on.
Yeah, at Citrus and the Citrus Policy Lab, I'm also the director of a project called Our Better Web, which is a collaboration with a few other colleges and departments. So the Goldman School of Public Policy is involved, Berkeley Law, the School of Information, the College of Engineering, and the Graduate School of Journalism. And we all came together because we knew that addressing the harms online cannot be done in isolation from these other disciplines. We all have to work together. And Our Better Web this semester, we are focusing on disinformation and deepfakes or synthetic media before election, which is perfectly timed with the
Hmm.
2024 presidential election just around the corner and the launch of all of these tools like GPT and uh, deepfake voice, which honestly, these are all at your fingertips right now.
Hmm.
Actually, a few weeks ago, I created audio deepfakes myself of Senator Ted Cruz, Elon Musk, and President Biden. And I just put that audio over slowed down video interviews that I found of them online. It was pretty convincing. I mean, in a matter of an hour, I was able to create a piece of synthetic media that I could have shared online, portraying them saying something that they
Hmm.
didn't say. So we are right now at this moment, it's like a powder keg of deepfake voice, deepfake imagery, and the creation of text or a script that sounds, like how those individuals speak. I think that we need definitely more safeguards. I believe that the use of the cryptographic hashing is a really promising step because it will automatically notify the public that that piece of media is synthetic. Actually, the piece that I made, I posted on YouTube, and
Hmm.
I said it's a private, but I could have made it public and shared it, and nobody would have been the wiser.
Yeah, and the ability of the AIs to just not just do that once, but just generate that in such a massive amount that you would be overwhelming a system's ability to be able to counter attack those things, or foreign, actors that could just create so much misinformation. It's really a dangerous thing. So it's really important work that you're doing. So one of the things that I learned from following some of the work that you have been doing is some of your concerns regarding the impact of AI on social justice and human rights. And you mentioned this really interesting article that I'm going to I'm going to pull up here. I think the machine bias article, some
Yeah.
software being used across the country to predict future criminals. That sounds like a Tom Cruise movie, I think. The pre-crime division, I think they called it. So, can you talk a little bit about some of that work and some of your concerns um, and these sort of issues?
Yeah. This was one of the first articles that came out that demonstrated that, the hype of AI really needed to be calmed by a very conscientious look at the risks. And ProPublica really did an excellent job of analyzing how this predictive analytics system that was predicting the likelihood of recidivism, so, the likelihood that they're going to commit a similar crime again, and they tested it, and overwhelmingly it predicted that African American individuals would recommit the crime. And what they tested it against was actually this white individual actually was a more likely reoffender. So it was clear that it was a biased tool. And this, I think, was something that really jump started the space of us thinking about how do we appropriately test these systems. And it's been just a burgeoning sector since then, where we are focusing a lot more on putting in place these assessment mechanisms. Um, we still have a long ways to go. And I think that one of the most important areas is definitely government or public sector use of AI enabled technologies. It is not lost on me that the government is often assigning rules to industry in their own development and deployment of AI systems, all the while governments themselves are designing and deploying these systems to try to make their provision of services more efficient and effective. I'd like to give one example. In Michigan, they released a tool that was meant to predict unemployment fraud claims, where individuals were getting unemployment allowances from the government. They deployed this tool and it flagged quite a few people. They followed through. They contacted those individuals and said, according to our model, you have likely committed unemployment fraud. You now owe us $100,000, and we're going to garnish your wages. Although this was right before the holiday season, like they did this in
Mhm.
November, early December. So these families, they're worried the government is coming after them, saying they owe $100,000. Who do they turn to? And it ended up being that the majority of those individuals, it was a false positive. It was a false flag
Hmm.
on those individuals. So to me, one of the most important sectors where we need more of these guardrails is actually in the public sector, whether
Hmm.
they're procuring a technology from a third party industry or they're designing and deploying it themselves. A lot more accountability needs to happen in government.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that government does tend to sort of get ahead of these technologies sometimes. A couple of weeks ago, we had someone who was talking about the government doing facial recognition for taxes and how they had attempted to do that, and then they had to back away from it because facial recognition doesn't work the same for everyone.
That's right.
And so all kinds of problems arose because of that. And then thankfully, they took that down. So I think just like the private industry tries to get there first and release things without thinking about all the consequences, government sometimes tends to do the same thing. I think it was the IRS who was releasing that. So just want to point out Stanley actually mentioned the right movie. That was Minority Report with the pre-crime division. I know that that's one thing that you also talked about, and I found this sort of surveillance article from, I think it was Atlanta, that where they were trying to also do predictive policing based on
Mhm.
where you lived, and that was another thing that you've talked about before, that
Yeah,
this is
let's
not
talk about
necessarily a
it.
great thing. Yeah.
Let's talk about it because a lot of these tools actually have their origins in higher education institutions.
Hmm.
So, one of the most popular ones called PredPol, which is predictive policing but shortened, was developed by a University of California campus. And so, I think also, you know, academia, we need to have more oversight over how we're designing and building out these AI enabled tools that are then turning into startup companies. And we've done some of that work within the University of California. We have something called the University of California AI Council, which came out of the UC Presidential Working Group on AI, that is set UC responsible AI principles and practices to guide the university's own procurement, development, implementation, and monitoring of AI systems. We do not touch research at this point, but I do think that that is an area where we need to be looking,
Mhm.
really putting up some appropriate checks and balances around research and how it is then deployed. Another example from another University of California campus, there was a tool that was developed called Pix to Pix, which could generate images, and it was open source. And a third party developed a tool that if you took a picture of a woman in her clothes, it would generate what she would likely look like without her clothing on. There was big backlash against that, and of course, and the individual ended up taking it down. I hope it's not available anymore. But there's this challenge, right? If you build these tools and you make them open source, while I know it is difficult to identify from the outset all of these nefarious use cases, what
Mm.
types of guardrails can we put in to try to mitigate some of those terrible, terrible uses?
Yes, I
Yeah.
mean, I think that developers a lot of times, it's like, I think scientists possibly do the same thing. They do things because they can, or they think that it's a technological challenge without thinking about what it actually means or what sort of impact is going to have. I mean, if you think about something like Facebook, yeah, you've talked about Facebook in the past before. Facebook was created as a way to rate people in campuses, and then it
Yeah.
became this much huger thing, and you have talked about how they've actually done some good things, but there's always the danger of, especially like in a larger company, groups of people will think that good ideas will generate revenue, market share or whatever without thinking about the impacts. And it can happen. We saw in government as well as in private companies as well. So, we talked a lot about the negative concerns about artificial intelligence. I know that you talk a lot about the positive things. So let's talk a little bit about the good things that some of these technologies, the impact that some of these technologies can have that are great.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned in the healthcare space, I think that's a really good example where when you combine an AI agent with a physician, they can have greater accuracy in identifying certain types of cancers or anomalies that, maybe the physician can't actually see when they're reviewing a chart,
Hmm.
but the model will see it. And one example actually that was really great, um, there were individuals who had like chronic knee pain, and they did a study and they found that um, the African Americans who had this chronic knee pain, even after the surgery, like, they still had the pain, and they couldn't really
Hmm.
figure out why, because looking at the X-ray or whatever, they're like, it looks like it should be fine. But then they trained a model and it actually found something that the physician couldn't see. And it was uniform pretty much across this entire group. So by using that, they were able to actually identify, wow, they are really suffering from this additional pain that wasn't captured in our previous analysis. Also, we have to think about how a lot of the field has developed, where you're essentially getting data from certain types of communities, and it's not inclusive of the diversity of individuals who have that problem. I think, is this the article? It might not be. There, the professor is a professor at Berkeley, and then the piece was published
Hmm.
in Nature. This might be
Yeah,
it.
I
You're
think it
so
does.
quick.
It does measure. Yeah.
There he is. Yeah, yes,
Yes.
Obermeyer. Very good. You're very quick. Um, okay, so I think the health space, that there are a lot of benefits there. Um, I mean, also, I think if AI enabled systems are deployed in a way where you have put in place, some type of risk evaluation and risk mitigation strategy and continuous monitoring over time. we can actually reap the great benefits of this technology, and mitigate the risks.
Yeah, I think there's going to be this age where we discover what machines are actually good for. There's always like crazy experimentation, crazy ideas. Right now, the focus seems to be on like, can I have it make my Excel spreadsheets? Okay, great. But there's a lot of things that AI can be super good at. It's just going to be better than people at analyzing massive amounts of data. I talked about creativity and how I can ask it for 100 ideas on a topic and then ask it for 100 more and 100 more, and it does that. It could do that all day. That's something that humans aren't good at. So I think finding the things that computers can do better than us and freeing people from doing those tasks, I think, is where some of the fantastic results can come from. Like that. That's a fantastic example, and it's one that I
Yeah.
hadn't looked at before.
I
Reducing
have I
racial
have one more
disparities in anything.
example
Super.
that I'd like to share. Yeah, one more. There is a tool called Trafficking, and it's Traffick. So it's a human rights and human trafficking issue. And what they did, they asked people, they crowdsourced images of hotel rooms. Some of them they pulled off the internet, and then also individuals can just take a quick snap of their hotel room, like right when they arrive, and send it off. And what they did, they trained the model to identify known like solicitation websites, to identify the hotel rooms based off of the images of the individual in the photo. So what happened, they were able to map out the hotels that are used for human trafficking and be able to intervene because they didn't know where those individuals were located. So to
Hmm.
me, that's just an outstanding example where you can really save people's lives by using this tool to identify where they
That's
are when they're being trafficked.
that is so positive and amazing. And I think that there are so many things like that out there that, I mean, it's nice to like somebody. I was having my wife was playing with the AI is trying to generate. I have a Boston Terrier whom I love. His name is Mojo. And we were trying to generate a Boston Terrier throwing at the Boston Tea Party, throwing tea from a ship. And I was having a hard time getting that image. And I thought, that's great, but I think that there's better uses for this technology that can have this amazing amount of impact. Although that, actually people jumped in and they helped me get improve on my prompting to get a better photo. So I'll make sure that I share that. It's
Yeah, you
actually on
have
my
to,
LinkedIn
right?
feed. Yeah.
And yeah, I wish
But
Mojo would make a cameo right now. But
yeah, yeah. Well, yes. Go ahead. Sorry.
on this topic, there is a whole sector of people
Hmm.
selling these prompts. And I was thinking the other day, the phrase that, the art is, driven by those who can wield the paintbrush. Well, now it's like those who can wield the prompt. Because I've been trying
That's
to play
right.
with it. My prompts produce terrible artwork. And then I look at
I
other
know what you
people's
mean.
prompts and I'm slowly learning about how much more
Hmm.
detailed you need to be. And it's really, I think, that is a skill set in itself, is generating
Yeah,
the
I,
appropriate prompt.
I call it the programming language of the next decade is going to be this AI prompting, because once you get good at it, you could really get the computers to do a lot of the work for you, and we're gonna discover. I mean, I'm so encouraged by some of the examples that you're showing, and just generally the work that you're doing, because I know that sort of highlighting these type of positive uses is probably what what the world needs a little more right now. There's plenty of bad things happening out there, but there's a lot of good that can be done, and it's important that we move the technologies forward in a responsible way. So you're working on a series that's going to be called Tech Hype. So can you talk a
Yes,
little
I
bit about what
am.
that is and what you're going to be doing? Yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to chat about it. So, we are launching a digital series called Tech Hype. In each episode, we debunk an emerging technology, provide insights into the real benefits and risks, and then identify what are appropriate technical and policy strategies moving forward. We've already recorded a few episodes, one on deepfakes, one on artificial intelligence, and one actually on platform trust and safety, which itself is
Mm.
not an emerging tech, but I think a very, very misunderstood area right now. And so that will be made available. It'll be on Apple TV. It'll be broadcast by the University of California TV network, and it will also be shared via our outlets. So Citrus, their YouTube, and the Goldman School of Public Policy's YouTube. The audio will be pulled off and shared through the Goldman School of Public Policy's Talk Policy to Me podcast. So I'm super
That's
excited.
fantastic. I'm so excited. Please let me know so that I can amplify that for sure. And I'm sorry, I was laughing because David was saying that he was actually in on the Boston Terrier Challenge, and he was just saying that that was a lot of fun. We actually had quite a few people get in on the action, and some of this, like you said, I feel like I am a newbie in terms of the prompting, even though I'm a developer. If people are starting to kind of break things down and analyze like the structure, and we have some courses on that, on how to do better prompting. So that's pretty cool, but it's going to become more and more important. I can't wait for your Tech Height series of episodes. That's going to be super exciting. And again, just let me know so that we can share it. And other than that, let's see if I have a couple of questions here that people wrote. So
Yeah.
David mentioned David again with the one of the people that helped me with the Mojo prompt, and says, this is a timely discussion. Canva just launched multiple AI technologies with 145 million
Mm.
users. That's a lot of risks if the AI generates a wrong image for a brand, or one that is later deemed proprietary at the source. Yeah, so what about that? Like the issues of, are companies now going to, like, that are using some of these tools, are they liable as well as the people generating, the content?
We're going to see, right? We have this class action lawsuit by
Hmm.
several artists against some of
Hmm.
these companies. So I think that case is actually going to help draw the line on responsible collection of data in right of approval. A very related issue is around data scraping. A lot of companies are trying to mitigate third party data scraping. However, lower courts have actually sided with the scraper, saying that you cannot block them. And this is actually a Microsoft LinkedIn case
I
um,
remember this.
against IQ Labs, where essentially the judge said, you, Microsoft, you cannot block IQ Labs from scraping data off of your platform because it could be anti competitive in California. Now it went to the higher court and it actually ended up going to the Supreme Court and it got kicked back to the Ninth Circuit. And the Ninth Circuit actually ruled in favor of LinkedIn, saying that HiQ Labs' behavior had violated the terms and conditions of Microsoft and that there was a potential for them to claim a violation of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. This is an issue that we're all dealing with right now because
Mm.
there's more awareness that these companies are scraping large amounts of data. One of my worries as an academic researcher is that we are now more and more reliant on using platform data scraping procedures because those platforms are restricting the data that they're making available through their application programming interfaces. So they're either limiting the data or they're making it incredibly expensive, like Elon Musk putting a $45,000 a month price tag on API access, which essentially means
Mm.
that any researcher cannot do research. This is a really tough space right now. Now, the proprietary nature with Canva, as I understand it, any of the images that are on Canva are royalty free, I believe. So
Hmm.
if you are on Canva and you're searching for an image, they're pulling from like Pexels and other royalty free sites.
Yeah,
So
it's
maybe it's okay.
such
I'm
a weird.
assuming that they're using the
Yeah.
royalty-free images.
Yeah. Yeah, so we're actually going to see all this kind of worked out. Like, this is getting all worked out by all the companies, and
Yeah.
there's going to be lawsuits, there's going to be adjustments. There's still, like you said, I mean, just because things haven't been worked out, it doesn't mean that innovation doesn't need to happen. It just needs to happen responsibly, and it's a process. Every regulation is going to happen, but and it's a good thing. Trust me, it's a good thing. You talked about some of the just potential horrible uses of the technologies, and it's something that is already happening. It's coming, and all these things are going to get worked out in the long term. So, super excited and happy that you were able to spend some time talking to me about these issues. I always feel a little bit better after doing these, because I feel like I learned so much just from every person that comes by. So I learned quite a bit from you. If you want to learn more about these topics, I have a link right here, go.rabo.org/TFIT. That's where you can get to all the previous episodes and the future episodes that are happening. And you can follow Brandy on LinkedIn, and make sure that you're there for the launch of her episodes coming up. And next week, we have a really exciting guest, Logan Kilpatrick. He's the head of developer relations at OpenAI. I'm really excited that he's going to be talking to us about the release of their new API. So they just released an API for GPT-4, and he's really trying to work on improving the documentation and making sure that they have not just the best product, but also the best developer access out there. So thank you so much, Brandy, for spending some time with us today. And I'll make sure that I send you a photo of Mojo and the Boston Terrier Tea Party. Take
Yes, I'm
care.
excited to see it. Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
All right. Bye bye.
Bye bye.